Merry Christmas, everybody. I hope you're having a great holiday season or otherwise celebrating in a special way the end of this year. Today, and for the last bonus episode of this 2023 Christmas week, we introduce what I think is the future for any Agile team out there. Sooner or later, Agile teams will start focusing on the key aspect of agility. Learning and learning as fast and as frequently as possible. And if you turn that learning knob all the way up to 11, to borrow a epic Spinal Tap film metaphor, what you get is experiment-driven development. Don't forget, each of these episodes is a companion to the Coach Your Product Owner e-course that you can get at bit.ly/coachyourpo. All one word, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/coachyourpo. All one word, all lowercase. This week, we have covered 4, and we'll cover one more topic that every Scrum Master should be able to help their product owners work on. And each of these 5 topics is a complement to one or more of the modules of the Coach Your PO e-course. So yesterday, I talked about running 24-hour experiments and how importantly, writing and deploying software is the slowest and most expensive way to learn. In yesterday's episode, I introduced the idea of the paper prototype-based usability test, which is, as I suggested, can help us learn in 24 hours or less. However, that's only one of the many possible experiment setups. There are many other types of experiments, and we will review a few examples in today's episodes. But before we look at examples, though, I want to talk about why this is so important. Not all experiments, and therefore not all hypotheses, are equally valuable. In other words, sometimes we have an idea that could have a 10x, that's a 10-time improvement impact on our product. But more often than not, the improvements we talk about are either not easy to quantify or they have a much smaller expected impact. It stands to reason, of course, therefore, that we should not spend the same amount of effort to validate all of those multiple hypotheses we come up with. While a 10x hypothesis may justify the whole team working on it for a whole sprint, a 10% improvement perhaps justifies a few hours of work at most. But we don't really know the impact of any idea or hypothesis before we run the experiment. We, after all, only have an assumption of what the impact might be. So how do we make a decision to, how much do we invest in this experiment before we know how big the impact is? Well, the answer to that is, of course, we run faster and cheaper experiments. While writing and deploying code can take days or weeks, having a conversation with a few potential customers may take only a few hours or even a few minutes. And this is where the concept of the experiment spectrum comes in. What is this experiment spectrum, you ask? Well, it's a range of different types of experiments that are designed to collect enough information from a few minutes to weeks or months. And there's a large amount of possible experiments to choose from. This depends, of course, on how much time we want to go without a learning opportunity. And learning really is the key here. So if we talk about the hour scale, so a few hours to run and collect information for an experiment, we have such options as user interviews, especially if the user interviews are already set up and scheduled frequently, as I talked about yesterday. Usability tests, there's an example of that in yesterday's episode. Paper prototype sales, and in the paper prototype, if I want to show an example or share an example here, I was once at a conference where we were asked, this was a Lean Startup workshop that I was being part of, and we were asked to validate a core assumption or a core aspect of value for a potential application for conference organizers, where they would offer discounts, public transportation tickets, etc., plus some other information. And instead of writing the application and then trying to sell it through the Google App Store, which would take weeks, if not months, What we did in the team that I was working with, what we did was that we designed the output of that application, right? The discount codes, the bus ticket or public transportation ticket, and so on. We designed that into a paper prototype, and we went around the conference venue directly, immediately during the workshop, trying to sell that information for €1. Of course, we would have that conversation and we would say, so in this paper, you have like a QR code that gives you a public transportation ticket, discounts at hotels and restaurants and bars nearby. And we try to sell that directly. And of course, the key idea here is that if you can't sell a paper prototype of an application, i.e. the value of the application that has the discounts and all of that for €1, you certainly can't sell that for 20 in the App Store, right? So that was a very quick paper prototype sales example. And that was the hour scale. Now, if we take the day or 24-hour scale, so say 24 hours to 5 days, we have such options as all of the above that we just discussed, but also customer surveys, if you already have a way to reach out to them, and sales calls with existing customers, including what I would call the sales pitch experiment template. I run a workshop where we talk about this, which I use to validate core assumptions or adoptions of sales, right? So it's an assumption or a core of assumption, a set of assumptions, about the adoption of the product or sales of the product. And that is, from 24 hours to 5 days, let's say. Then if we go beyond the week range, so weeks to months, let's say 1 week to 3 months, we have other options, just like, of course, all of the above will fit, but also landing page tests, email list tests. If we use an existing mailing list to run the experiment, we could create some podcast episodes, YouTube videos-based experiments, and of course, also running the actual software in production. Now, this spectrum that goes from a few hours to a few weeks is our friend, especially when we want to make sure that we don't over-invest into validating an hypothesis from which we are not expected to get a huge return, right? If something is not going to contribute significantly to our goal, then we want to invest a little bit less and get a little bit more knowledge before we decide to invest more. Can you imagine how much software the teams would not write if they could quickly validate their assumptions? And that's one of the Agile principles, the maximize work not done principle. Because after all, the cheapest software to operate is the one that isn't developed. And also there's another maxim for you to keep in mind, that code is a liability. Therefore, we must achieve a certain level of confidence in its value before we write the software, deploy the software, and end up, of course, maintaining the software. In some teams that I've worked with, we would run experiments even for already existing code. And based on the results of those experiments, we would decide or not to remove that code from the product. We call this the kill criteria for features. Features that did not provide enough value ended up being removed from the product, therefore reducing the overall maintenance costs for that product. And that's what I call experiment-driven development. We run experiments to add and also to remove functionality from the product. But many of you, especially Scrum Masters, are also aware that products are not the only domain of experimentation. As Scrum Masters, we must run experiments all the time in our process. After all, we can't get better at what we do unless we are constantly learning and therefore experimenting. I remember one of the teams that I work with did not start by running experiments with the product itself. They first started by running experiments in their process. And as time went by, they got more comfortable and familiar with the idea of running experiments. They also helped the product owner to become more comfortable and familiar with running experiments, and ultimately ended up running experiments in the product itself as well. But it was the aspect of running experiments in practice with their processes that made them confident enough and the product owner as well, to start running experiments in the product. So don't underestimate the self-experimentation as a powerful way to get teams and product owners familiar with the process and, of course, thinking about the process and ultimately converging to experiment-driven development, which, as I introduced at the start of the episode, in my mind, is the future of agility. So today we talked about how, if we focus on learning, we eventually end up with experiment-driven development. We talked about the spectrum of experimentation, how we have many different types of experiments that we should run based on how much value we expect from that assumption. We also talked about different types of experiments from a few hours to a few days. There's quite a few examples in this episode, so just go back and listen. And finally, we talked about how a powerful mental model for Scrum Masters is learning through experimenting with our process. That way we can get comfortable with experimenting by running concrete experiments in our processes, and that as Scrum Masters we can start doing right away and continuously. And through that, introduce the practice of experiment-driven development before even starting to experiment with the product. Now, all of this week's episodes are companion episodes to the Coach Your Product Owner e-course that you can check out and purchase at bit.ly/coachyourpo, all one word, all lowercase. In version 1 of that course, module 4 talks about understanding and communicating customer needs. And customer needs is a valuable concept when we try to assess possible impacts of our hypotheses and decide how much we can invest into an early learning-focused experiment. Understanding customer needs allows us to understand better what could provide value, therefore also how much value it could provide, and then define better experiments. Also in version 1, but module 6, talks about a quick way to prioritize the product backlog. And that same technique can be used to prioritize assumptions and experiments to run. In version 2, module 2, we talk about how we can help product owners set up their product goal, including how to involve stakeholders in setting up that goal. And setting up a goal is the key aspect that enables us to achieve experiment-driven development. You can get more information and purchase the Coach Your PO e-course at bit.ly/coachyourpo. That's bit.ly/coachyourpo, all one word, all lowercase. If you think that getting coaching and hands-on support is a better option for yourself, you can contact us at coaching@oikosofi.com. That's coaching@oikosofi.com. And the link will be on the show notes for you to check out and contact us easily. Now, we hope you learned from this bonus week of episodes, and we invite you to get in touch if you have questions or if you want to learn more about our products and consulting services. Remember, a rising team lifts all products. I'll see you next week for another regular week of episodes. For now, I want to wish you a Happy New Year. Happy New Year, everybody. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.